Hello, everyone, and welcome to my latest Substack Live. Um, for those who haven't watched the previous one, I am Wendy Gordon, and my Substack is Changing Lives. It is about mental and spiritual health, and I am a former pastor and a depression survivor and deconstruction survivor, and so that's why I'm passionate about both mental health and spiritual well-being. And I do writing and speaking and lead support groups and do one-on-one coaching via Zoom. So if any of that interests you, you're welcome to DM me on Substack. Um, and my guest today is Sarah Lee Kane. So I will let her introduce herself and a little bit about her work.
Yeah, hi. Thanks so much, Wendy. And hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining. My name is Sarah. My Substack is called Searching for Enough, and it's fairly self-explanatory, but just a quick spiel. Was really born out of my obsession with just observing societal expectations and really about let's say consumption and things like that, and sort of taking a step back and going, actually, is this what I want? Is this what can I actually perform those things that are expected of me? And how is that going to help me live up my values? And so the Substack's really an exploration on that. A lot of personal essays. I featured different voices. Wendy's was a voice I featured. And so I am a freelance writer, longtime meditator. I say on my Substack I basically like burned my life to the ground plus times. I've just been everywhere. And yeah, just looking forward to today's conversation.
Great. Yeah, and my Substack covers very similar themes. So it's wonderful that we're able to have this conversation because yeah, so much of society's values are toxic. I'm actually leading a book study for another group on Zoom on Dr. Gabor Mate's The Myth of Normal.
Mm.
And it is all about how toxic our culture is and the pressure to achieve and the emphasis on productivity at all cost and all of the negative ways that impacts families and individuals. Um, and it's a very eye-opening book, a lot about mental health and physical health and the ways in which our society makes both worse. Um, and a big piece of that is that social pressure to perform and that we can never be enough, we can never do enough. There's always some way that we could improve ourselves, something new to buy, and at at what cost? Basically, the cost of our relationships and our overall well-being as work encroaches more and more on our lives. Um, and he talks about it for himself as a doctor that for, a long time he was a workaholic and that's the socially acceptable addiction basically. Um, but yeah, today we're actually going to focus on ancestral trauma and wisdom specifically. And so the definition is pretty self-explanatory there. We're talking about the trauma and the wisdom that we can get from our ancestors, not just our parents or even grandparents, but going back multiple generations, which is a topic that is really of interest to me. Um, a little bit of my personal background is that my mom's father died by suicide when she was 10 years old. So we have a lot of trauma, as you can imagine, just from that. My mother's life was very much affected, as were her siblings, and um, the others in my grandfather's family, his siblings and his parents, and back and um, I had an interesting experience recently where we were asked to close our eyes and ask an ancestor for guidance, for wisdom. And that was the first time I was introduced to the idea of ancestral wisdom. There's so much focus on the trauma that we carry and how it's passed down through the generations, and not as much on the wisdom. And at first, I had a hard time picturing an ancestor to give me wisdom because really all I was aware of was the trauma. But then it occurred to me, well, wait a minute. My grandmother, the wife of the person who died by suicide, yes, she went through a lot of trauma and didn't process all of it by any means, but that also means there's wisdom to be gained there. Just the fact that she survived and raised 3 children on her own and, prior to that, she had survived the Great Depression. And so I think there's so many ways that, our culture tends to devalue our elders and kind of want to deny the unpleasant parts of our history. But when we are willing to take an honest look at them, we can see not only the trauma, but the wisdom that we can get out of it. So I'm curious, Sarah, how does that land with you, and have you had any experiences related to that?
Yeah, no, it lands really well. I think of an ancestor as anybody who's passed. Like
Hmm.
that's part of my, I guess, lineage, so called. So I count my grandfather as my ancestor, people born for him before as my ancestor.
Hmm.
And so for me, I think ancestral wisdom and the lessons we can learn might not necessarily be from people many generations before. It could be someone that was alive and now is no longer here. And so, just as an example, with my grandfather, he was a very devout Buddhist. And I remember visiting his house, and he had a little like altar, and we would have incense, and I would see him with his beads, and just those memories are so like visual in my mind. Like I can if you call me if you tell me now to just recall visually like his hands and the him moving his thumbs with the 108 beads, I could really visualize it. And so that I know left quite a big impression on me. It has led me to become interested in yoga, like really tangentially.
Hmm.
I on and off meditated in my teens and then returned into it in my 20s, and so now I've been regularly meditating for gosh, like decades now. And so I think it's what's really interesting what you said about trauma, like inheriting or not inheriting, sorry. The trauma that you yeah, actually I'll say inherit, like the trauma
Hmm.
that you inherit or the lessons that you inherit from your ancestors, they're all encompassing, right? Like you can't have the good without the bad. And it's really what's I think interesting to me is um just that acceptance of that and really understanding that you can't have one with the other.
Right.
And then also how do you work with it, right? Like what does that even mean to work with ancestral wisdom and the things that were
Hmm.
passed down?
Yeah, and I think indigenous cultures do such a better job of that than at least my Western culture here in the U.S. does. Like I said earlier, we tend to kind of make invisible people as they get older and they're no longer in the paid workforce. Women especially, kind of tend to become invisible. We look past them. We don't turn to them for wisdom. And I know I wish that I knew more about my ancestors and their lives. I know very little. Um, and my dad's deceased now, so I can't ask him about, his childhood or what his dad's family was like. And my mom, with I know a little bit more about, but most of what I know is, centered around the horrible trauma that she went through, as a 10-year-old child. And um, so not as much about other things. Um, but one reason that I thought it would be great to have you on today is because we do both focus on issues of enoughness and issues of values and living in alignment with our values. And I think that the connection there is that in order to be our authentic selves and live into our values, we have to understand the unconscious residue that we carry from all of this inherited ancestral trauma. And it can be healing to become more conscious of their wisdom as well. Uh, it's just something that doesn't get talked about much in our culture, but yet it's so powerful. Even before we're born, that we're carrying down this. I'm really fascinated by epigenetics in particular,
Mhm.
and that they're showing like descendants of the Irish potato famine in the 1800s. Even to
Mm,
this day, they have some
yeah.
genetic mutations related to appetite and hunger based on that. And same thing with Holocaust survivors and anything that we might think, oh well, that's far enough in the past that how could it affect someone born now? But yet somehow it does in very powerful ways.
Yeah, and I think how I understand it is more if when it's something affects someone. So I'm just going to use just because it's relevant to my family immigration. So my dad's side of the family, they've immigrated, all over the world. Many are in Australia, Canada, U.S., South Africa. I'm an like I was a first generation immigrant, so I immigrated from Hong Kong to Canada. Now I'm in the U.S. And so I think about my parents' experience and how they came to this unfamiliar place, right? They go to a supermarket, they may not quite understand what's
Hmm.
there. They're relating to banking for the first time, right? School systems, all of these things that many people take for granted, for example,
Hmm.
right? And so all of these emotions that they're holding, whether or not they understood it, gets passed down to me
Right.
by the way they interact, how they parent, how we observe them on the phone. Like I remember, I think my father was trying to understand a credit card bill or something like that, and he was on the phone, and I happened to walk in and overhear this conversation. Like those things all affect me, right?
Hmm.
And so that's really how I interpret ancestral, like lineage or like inheriting like ancestral wisdom or trauma, whatever you call it. And so then you also, I mean, I also think about my parents also have inherited from their parents how they treated them. So all of the things that have led up to me being who I am, how I act, how I
Hmm.
speak is really as a result of everybody's upbringing. I also think about the fact that I spoke English fairly fluently when I was 4 or 5 by the time I immigrated to Canada. That provided a different life for me versus someone who may have come, to the US or whatever other, immigrant to whatever country with a big language barrier, right?
Hmm.
Or they maybe were forced to move. And so that trauma also really informs how they act. So that those are all things I think about, and it shapes my values. It shapes
Hmm.
how I view like one of like a big value of mine is autonomy and security. How I view that would be very different from let's say how my mother and my father views that, and how it plays out as well.
Absolutely, yes. And uh, beyond that, like at the deeper unconscious level, I think that the belief that we're not enough
Hmm.
is so tied to messages that we get not only from our own childhood or the wider culture, but going back generations. My mom didn't have the any kind of resources to deal with the trauma she went through as a 10-year-old child.
Hmm. Hmm.
My grandmother, didn't get therapy for her or the kids, and they didn't really talk about it. And back then, no one in the culture did. Mental illness carried so much stigma.
Hmm.
PTSD, not much was known about it at that point, or at least, in the culture as a whole, and getting help for it, there really wasn't much available. And so that all gets passed down. But like I said earlier, at the same time, we sometimes lose sight of the fact that good things get passed down too. There's so much emphasis on the trauma and how it shapes us that we can forget, well, there's also the resilience after the trauma. There's also, um, like you said, whether it's with immigration to a new country, how did they survive? How did they didn't know the language? What did they do? How did they communicate? How did they make it work? Um, and all of us, except for Native Americans, of course, are immigrants, descendants of immigrants.
Hmm.
And so at some point in our lineage, we have some kind of experience of ancestors coming to a new country, quite possibly not knowing the language, not having employment lined up in advance,
Hmm.
and in some cases having to build their own shelter, perhaps, or
Hmm.
just all kinds of hardships that we can't even imagine. And and yet here we are, descendants of them. So obviously they found a way to make it work.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think Um, when I first started thinking about ancestral wisdom, and I know Lama Rod Owens, I don't know if you've ever heard of him, but he talks a lot about that. I think he has a book called Love and Rage, and there's a chapter on it about just like a meditation practice to kind of call in your
Mhm.
ancestors and the wisdom and all of that. Um, oh my gosh, my apologies, I lost my train of thought.
That's okay. Happens to me all the
Um,
time.
yeah, so I think I think what's interesting to me, I used to think that stuff was really woo woo, like let's be frank,
Mhm,
um, but it can be really practical. So I mean, I'm going to use ancestry.com um, as an example. Like if you really wanted to find out about, let's say, your relatives
mhm,
or you know, how they immigrated, how they moved here,
mhm,
you know, let's say you want to know about your great great grandmother or something like that. You can, for most people, I wouldn't say everybody, most people, you can probably type your name and
mhm,
enter a couple details, and you can find that, and you can learn a lot about maybe their occupation, maybe when they landed in the US, or you know who they're married to, and sort of all those things. And even I think having an understanding of that is really helpful. I mean, you may not, or at least for me, when I started learning about sort of where my parents were born, the circumstances in which they even moved to Hong Kong in the first place. So um, you know, there was a civil war you know, in China that led a lot of refugees actually to go from mainland China to Hong Kong. Like, so my parents were part of that. So even just having understanding, and then you know, you can go down rabbit holes of like, let's look
yeah,
at the history of like, let's actually look at the wider context of
mhm,
not even just like what happened to them, but like, you know, the sort of historical context of why that happened. And it's just so, it can be really fascinating. And I think the more I got interested in that, the more it really helped me um, understand, I guess, in a way, just going back to parents and grandparents, like their behaviors. And I
mhm,
think that going back to the whole enoughness piece can be really healing and helpful to not accept negative behaviors, right? Just, you know, just in general, but really have an understanding of why that could be
mhm,
a behavior that has happened, right? And that can also help to give yourself a little more compassion if you know, there's that phrase like, "Oh, you act like your mother, you act like your father," like
yeah,
as you're getting older or something like that,
mhm,
right? And I've certainly have had those instances where I'm like, "Oh my gosh, that's something my father used to do. That's something my mother used to do." Like that's like you know, behaviors that I may not necessarily like, but it
right.
helps give you more compassion to yourself. I think having the understanding um, of ancestors and the context and all that is helpful in like broader ways, and I think I even realize now.
Yeah, I would agree, and even applying it to society as a whole, I think, for instance, of, like, Mary Trump writing her book about Donald Trump and explaining the reason he is the way he is, let's just say,
Mhm.
is if you look at his childhood and, his grandfather and so forth, and his family tree and the issues that and abuse and other things, it really brings home the point that, yeah, I mean, we're all deeply affected, um, by not only our own ancestry, but other people's ancestry that
Mhm.
we interact with or that have power over our lives. And it's both alarming in some ways, but also
Mhm.
fascinating because there's so much potential for healing if we're aware of that trauma and we can bring it from our unconscious to our conscious mind of how it's affected us. That's when the healing becomes possible and we can say, you know, this whatever stops with me, and we can develop the coping skills to um, challenge that behavior, or, you know, if necessary, not have contact with those people, or on the flip side, to reconcile with those people, because we do, as you
Mhm.
said, have that greater understanding now of, oh, this is what happened to them that made them the person they are, that brought out this behavior that we don't like.
Yeah, just to kind of maybe paraphrase or riff on what you're saying is, um, you know, I don't know why World War II is popping in my head, but just as an example, let's say your ancestors were Nazis, like they were pretty
Hmm.
significant in you know destruction and traumatizing other groups of people, right?
Hmm.
And I think about that. Let's say that's your ancestral history, like okay, and when you were saying like that stops with me, it's really that understanding. Okay, this is what happened. Um, like yes it maybe whether or not that's passed down to me, but I'm now responsible with what I do with this knowledge or this
Hmm.
that's whatever has passed down to me, and so I can use that to change my behavior or to try to do things that kind of hopefully line up um, situations, actions, whatever you want to call it, for even the next generation, right? Because in like the reality is we are future ancestors, right? Like we are going to
Mhm.
pass. Someone might take our wisdom or trauma,
Mhm.
right? And then take it and do what they will with it. And so I think that's also a really interesting perspective to me, because I feel like I don't want to take it too seriously. I don't want to take life too seriously, but it also like gives me pause. Be like, oh, like my actions are going to not only affect, let's say, my son, it's going to affect, let's say, policy, like however, like directly. And so that's something I think a lot about as well.
Mhm. Yeah, and if you just think about how rapidly our culture has changed completely, even just in terms of like inventions and our
Hmm.
ancestors didn't have cars, they didn't have indoor plumbing, they didn't have air conditioning, let alone computers, the internet, etc. I mean,
Hmm.
so much has happened in a relatively short span of time that it's pretty mind-blowing to think of the changes that they have lived through and what that must have been like for them.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, for sure. And it's interesting when I think about changes. So, like, again, just using immigration as an example, that's pretty big change, right?
Yeah.
War is pretty big change. Actually, childbirth is a pretty big change.
Mm.
Things like that, and how they handled it. Um, and this is something I'm going to pose to you, or this is just a thought that I'm thinking about. Is um, there's a lot of things that have been passed down through written history, right, or through oral history. But what about
Mhm.
the things that aren't recorded, or we don't have any knowledge of, you know that have been lost? Like how I wonder how that gets inherited or how that gets passed down. Or does that even affect us if we don't know what any of that is?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. And I'm certainly no expert, and I'm not like a mental health or medical professional or a researcher who has studied all this stuff. But I think it does affect us. How could it not? It's not so much of like our core beliefs. And like we were talking about before, the belief that I'm not enough, which is almost
Mhm.
universal with everyone, and whatever happens in your family in some way, just because there's no such thing as a perfect parent who always meets all of your
Mhm.
needs all the time. Um, we can't help but develop that, and it does, it can be traced back through the generations, and there's so many things. Um, that it's interesting. In fact, I remember as a child, I had this one recurring dream that involved grandfather clocks, and all it was me in this room full of grandfather clocks, and being filled with this strange mix of emotions, like a combination of fear and sadness and anger and shame, and just all bundled up. And I couldn't make sense of that dream until, um, I thought about it and was old enough to be aware that my grandfather had died by suicide, and so I
Mm.
think I was carrying those emotions, and they were being expressed somehow through in my subconscious through the dreaming. Um, so I think there are a lot of instances like that, and some of them, of course, are more blatant and like, someone was abused as a child and they grow up and become an abuser, or they marry an
Mhm,
abuser,
mhm,
then the connection is more obvious. Um, but it's definitely there, and it's interesting to look at it and to look at the broader implications for society as a whole, and who we choose as our leaders, and as how we each function as individuals and who are in various systems. And
mhm,
since you mentioned about like what gets shared orally or written, like whether we even know the stories, um, since one of my interests is spirituality, I'm very interested in the Gospel of Mary and other books that didn't make it into the
mhm,
Bible that are now being studied extensively.
mhm,
Some of were relatively recent discoveries, but others were deliberately suppressed by the patriarchal church, centuries ago. And yeah, it does make you wonder, what if the full picture had been told from the beginning, and the divine feminine, divine masculine were seen as equal and both equally necessary and both present in all genders and all of that. how different would our society be now if that untold story had been told?
Mhm. I will say this, I mean, this is, I guess, ancestral work, but it
Mhm.
kind of, it's under, let's say, something I don't say I feel ashamed about. I'm working on is actually trying to learn to read Chinese, and so that's something I can read it, but not like an actual book
Uh-huh.
or like formal Chinese, like more complicated vocabulary. And part of why I'm doing that is I really want to have an understanding of historical texts, folk tales, things like that. And that's just not something I was ever interested in growing up. That was not something that necessarily was taught to me growing up for various reasons. And now I feel like it's really important for me to just use that to have an understanding of who I
Mhm.
am and where I come from, and in a way, an understanding of my relatives and
Mhm.
my parents, just sort of where I don't know, certain idioms come from, certain phrases, like, for example, the apple of my eye, everybody sort of knows that phrase. Where does it really come from? Like, as an
Mhm.
example. And so it's just really those kind of things that I think a lot about as well. You know, English had become my first language through immigration. Like, when before we moved, I spoke Cantonese fairly fluently. I mean, I still do, but if you ask me to like listen to things about history, probably not. The vocabulary is a little beyond me.
Mm.
But I think about that too. I think about people who may not have access to certain knowledge, who may not be near family members to access some of this, right? Where do they go for it? And so it's not even just about like what is ancestral wisdom and how do we like and what do we do with it? It's really how can we even access it, right? Like there's the subconscious stuff, which is great, and I'm sure there are lots and lots of examples of that. But there's also that really tangible. If I'm really looking for something, do I even have access to that?
Yeah, and that's been a challenge for me because my last name is Gordon, which is an incredibly common last
Right.
name. So to even try to do the research and figure out, okay, who were my ancestors? Like, I don't have their names, their dates of birth, all of that kind of stuff. And even if I did, there's going to be more than one person with that name that lived in that time frame, and so
Hmm.
it is challenging to go back and even beyond my parents and grandparents, that's about it. And even, like I said, even then, I don't know that much about what my dad's life as a child was like, let alone what his dad's life was like as a child.
Hmm.
Um, but the wisdom piece that's interesting to me now is that my dad's father owned an appliance store, and my mom's mother was a realtor. And I didn't know that until I was older. But it's fascinating to me now that I'm trying to, in my 50s, have this new career of being self-employed and being an
Hmm.
entrepreneur. It's like, wow, I wish I could have had conversations with them, um, face to face, about entrepreneurship and owning your own business, and what's that like, and the whole marketing aspect of things. How did you uh, get business, and how did you sustain yourself while you
Mhm.
were, just starting to grow your business? Those kinds of questions. And I just think there's so many things like that at least for me, that I don't even know about my ancestors, that I wish I knew more about, and let alone, the ancestors before them. I wonder how far back that kind of entrepreneurial spirit goes, and how that was lived out for others. Uh,
Mhm. Yeah, I think back we were talking earlier about, um, support, like the support that the ancestors give us, whether it's somebody that was alive and is no longer here, or that we've encountered, that was alive is no longer here,
mhm,
or previous generations. I think a lot about not only their like patterns and behaviors, but really in the way that they're still kind of around to support us. I can, going back to your dream, like that was a sign that someone, wanted to contact you, right?
Mhm.
Whether or not there was a lesson in that, who knows? Maybe it was just to show you that, oh, actually, this is what happened in my family, even just that,
Mhm.
or this is an emotion that happened often in her family that, hey, you're gonna have to go through, right? That's something
Yeah.
that you're accessing. Like I think a lot about, um, like when someone passes, like for example, like my husband's grandmother really loved cardinals, and that was one of her favorite birds. And so everybody really, if that side of the family takes it as a sign when they see a cardinal, out in the wild, that's
Mhm.
her. That's her just saying hello. And so I think about like, can we think about that with our ancestors? Like, can they come and say hello? Like um, I remember finding like my grandfather really loved birds, and I cannot I mean, I hope I'll be able to describe, but in China they had these bird cages, and a lot of them are made from wood or bamboo. So like how you have like the metal bird
Mhm.
cages. So instead of that, they're not made. I think the modern ones are made of metal. So and the bottom would have like these beautiful carvings, and there's like a hook on the top because a lot of people from my grandfather's generation, and I would say maybe now, at least in Hong Kong, anyways. I don't know if it's true in the U.S. They would take their little birds, and it's like kind of like they're walking their dog, right? They take their birds in the
Aw.
park, and they'll show them off, like they'll hang out with their friends, and they've got their little birds and all of that. Um, and so I saw one of those a couple weeks ago at a yard sale. It was like so like I haven't seen one of those in decades, and I was like, oh, like I wonder if that's a sign from him, like saying
Mhm.
hello or something like that. Um, it was so interesting. I remember, like I learned. So at my father's funeral, there's so during the proceedings, you have a monk. He wanted this. He had a monk come and do like chants and things like that. And one of the things that happens, I don't know how common this is. So if anybody can chime in, that'd be great. But anyway, so usually they have sort of a kind of an altar, and so they would have like rice and food. You give it to the person who just passed away as an offering for them to kind of
Mhm.
move on, like a sustenance for their to move on to their next life or to their journey to the afterlife. And so, anyways, there was a bowl of rice with chopsticks kind of straight down the center of it, and I was like, "Oh, that's so interesting! Like, what is that?" And I remember um, looking it up because my mother was like, I don't know what that means either. And
Mhm.
so we looked it up. And then I remember, so it actually is supposed to represent incense, and like it's usually for the dead. Like when you have chopsticks in the middle of a bowl of rice, that's what it means. Just that's basically what it means. Anyway, so then I remember years later, I found a book written by a Chinese American, and she had different like Chinese like holidays. And I remember flipping through that book, and then she actually explained the bowl of rice with the chopsticks. I forgot which holiday. Like I just would have random like things pop up on social media or blogs that I'm reading that about that. I was like, oh, maybe that's like my father coming, like not coming back, but like giving me
Mhm.
signs, or like my ancestors giving me signs that this is something I need to like keep learning, like be proud of where I've come from, be proud of my, Asian or Chinese ancestry, and
Mhm.
like keep learning more and more. And so I think that's really directly influenced my desire to now continue to learn the language and to learn more about the history. And so that's something I think about because I could possibly pass it down to my son. Like maybe
Mhm.
that's really a way for me to, like, my ancestors' way of saying like continue this. Like we want the next generation to understand this because it's important, right? It'll help. It could be with the feelings of enoughness, right? Knowing where you're coming from, knowing all the cool, like, I don't know, rituals, things like that.
Mhm.
Yeah. So, anyways, I thought that was just something really interesting to me.
Yeah,
That is.
definitely. And I'm
Yeah.
fascinated by people who do seem to have the ability to connect with their ancestors going back many generations, and um, cultures that use plant medicine, psychedelics,
Mhm, mhm,
as part of a journey, a religious ritual of calling in the wisdom of the ancestors and their spirits to help guide them on making a decision. uh, I think that's just so powerful, and it's something that I again kind of wish that I had more knowledge about my ancestors, or more of a sense that that they are speaking to me, and okay, what is their message for me?
Yeah. And And something I think about too, and I hope I'm gonna articulate this well, but you know, we can also think about the wisdom of ancestors that are not just our own. So
Hmm.
I just had a conversation with a friend about this the other day, and we were talking about like Buddhism and sort of the five precepts and the things that you can like the some of the lessons and the wisdom you can gain from some of that, whether or not you want to go down that Buddhism rabbit hole or
Right.
you're like a secular meditator or whatever. Um, and she was like, like it's just so fascinating. Like I am benefiting from this practice. I'm benefiting from someone thousands of years ago um, who took the time to record this and then take the time to pass it to like along with other people. And now like
Hmm.
or monks or like lay people is what they call people who aren't monks, like who live out in the real world. Like she's like, I'm really benefiting from something like this. And I think a lot about that. I think about just let's say the women's suffrage movement. Like I benefit from that, right?
Right.
Even though that's those are not technically they're not technically mandated, but I think a lot about that. So I think a lot about like even um the what you and I are doing now, like maybe future generations that are that were not their ancestors can benefit from what we're doing or how we're trying to help, right? um and so I think when we think about ancestral wisdom, it's I would suggest I don't want to say like advise, I would suggest maybe thinking about like how we benefited from all of that, because it's just like the more I think about it, the more I'm like, wow, that gives me a lot of like hope that
Yes.
um, that whatever has happened in the past, yes, there's obviously a lot of trauma, right? Like, let's not deny that, but there's also from within that trauma, there were people who are really fighting for the welfare of everyone, right? For their freedom, for their well being, whatever you want to call it.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I agree 100%. And like, in the times we're living in now, I draw great inspiration from the civil rights movement. And
Mm,
before that, like you said, women's suffrage movement. Um, the go, back to Gandhi in India, or like the Dalai Lama, and Desmond Tutu, and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. Um, Obviously that they aren't my ancestors in a literal sense, but they are these role models for me spiritually, and just hands-on concrete action, and their actions give me hope that we can somehow come together too and find ways to build a more just society. um,
mhm,
and even going back way back, I mentioned earlier about Mary Magdalene, and the information that's starting to come out about her, and her gospel, and the other writings that are being shared now, that as kind of supplementary information to the books that are already in the Bible. And it's like she is like a spiritual role model for me. She is an ancestor that I can look to for, like, oh, I don't have to, see my body as bad and sinful and opposed to the spiritual stuff. I can integrate them, and I can see that, I am made in the image of God just as much as anyone else. And that there
mhm,
is this whole tradition of women being seen as equal to men, and having um, gifts to bring, and being looked up to. And same thing with the indigenous cultures, where women are, seen as elders, and it was an honor, and younger people were deferential to them because of the wisdom that they had to transmit. And
mhm,
I think we've just lost a lot of that in our culture, and we don't. Um, Take the time to talk with, and share stories with, and listen to the stories of
mhm,
people that are older. And then we, at least in my case, wish that we had, while they were still alive,
mhm,
that I had
mhm,
thought to ask these kinds of questions and learn more about my
mhm.
direct ancestors.
Yeah, yeah, no, and I will say, like, it's sometimes hard, like, not to give as an excuse, but just sort of like a little bit compassion. It's like it's sometimes difficult to kind of straight up ask, like, and
Yes.
all like for me, anyways. Like let's say my parents, I'm like. I remember asking my mother a few questions about something, and she either didn't know or it just was not a conversation that was comfortable
Hmm.
or that she necessarily felt like she could share. And so I remember like in the past I'd be like, oh, why don't you want to talk to me? But now I'm like, okay, I get it. Like there's conditioning there as well. And so I think there needs to be a little bit of grace where, like, if we're trying for this and it's not working, it doesn't mean like we give up, but we have to have an understanding. Like maybe sometimes we might have to look at a textbook
Hmm.
and then go back, right?
Right.
Or I know there's services. Not saying you have to use them, but I know there's services that give you, I think, like a sort of process or a guideline as how to record your parents' kind of like life, like their
Yes,
history, like
definitely. There.
yeah, when you
Mhm.
were born, like all like, and then there's decks of cards that have conversation starters where you can start doing that. So there's definitely lots of help out there, but even like this me learning my like learning what was my first language again, right? And learning to read text again, those like it's a lot of effort, and there are times when I don't want to do it.
Hmm.
Like I think I did put a pause in this summer with my Chinese language lessons just because I'm like I've got so much going on.
Hmm.
But I am also aware that when fall comes around, I have a little bit more time. I don't want to get stuck in that, oh, this was too hard, right?
Yeah.
um, because I do think it is worth it, in whatever capacity for you to learn.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely worth it. And like you said, also very challenging and easy to, kind of have at the bottom of the to-do list, and other things end up being higher
Mhm.
priorities as much as you want to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's just like for me, I think I don't like when I was younger, I used to think like, oh, this stuff's boring, right? Like
Yeah.
why do I care?
Hmm.
Like it doesn't shape who I'm looking towards the future, right? Like that could be a product of my 20s. I don't really
Yeah.
know, but now that I'm in my 40s, I'm like, oh, this is important for different reasons. Maybe I'm
Hmm.
thinking about my mortality a little bit more. I don't know, but it's just interesting how the older I get, the more it's like now it's really, really important. But I see a lot of younger folks talking about some of this and um, understanding that this is important to learn, not necessarily for themselves, but for their passion in, let's say, helping others or the
Hmm.
causes they're volunteering for, things like that.
Absolutely. Yeah, and like I was mentioning earlier with the civil rights movement, I mean,
Mhm.
it's so easy these days to just, yeah, be fall into despair and think, I'm one person.
Mhm.
What can I do that's going to make
Mhm.
any difference? I have no power in this situation. Um, and then look back and say, yeah, I'm one person, but I can look at what these other individuals did, and they found other people to join their in common cause with, and they did change society in really dramatic ways. And
Mhm.
so they can be the source of inspiration. And even though, they didn't live necessarily to see all of the fruits of the work they put in, we are all the beneficiaries of it. And so, like you said, we can then in turn see ourselves as, okay, what's my legacy going to be? What what do I want to um, put out into the world that could help shape, what the world will become, even if I'm not alive to see it.
Yeah, and to that, I think I also want to say, if we're thinking about our legacy and what we want to put forth in the world, it doesn't have to be a grand gesture. I just think about like I don't like parenting just because I'm a parent to an 11-year
Mhm.
old. I think about like some of the things that were passed down to me or the things that, you know, um, that seem perfectly normal to say or do or whatever it is, right? That I'm like, no, actually that's to me, I feel like that is not okay, right? And I choose not to do any of that in my parenting. I choose not to say any of that,
Mhm.
right? That to me is actually a huge deal because I won't know how my son's going to turn out. Like, I can do
Right.
my best, and he may go to therapy over me. I don't know, but right. But my hope is that by my everyday interactions, he hopefully will take that and then do what he will, and hopefully it's a positive thing, right?
Hmm.
I think people who sign petitions, that seems like a tiny thing, but that could have huge ripple effects. Being nice to like the person at the grocery store, you never know that that could be a small action. Um, but I think it's one of those where I feel like we kind of went all over the place with it, which is good, right?
Hmm.
Like we go from ancestral wisdom and trauma, and then like informing how we act and doing things. It's really just, I think it's we don't always have to have like concrete lessons from our ancestors, but it's
Right.
really, I think it's really just that willingness to even kind of open ourselves to seeing what's around us with, like, let's say the signs from our like loved ones who
Hmm.
passed, or reading stories. It's just being open, and it helps us be open and have this awareness of even what's happening now. I think if that's the biggest thing that people can kind of take away from this, I hope that will be helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you made a good point earlier that, when you were younger, all of the idea that you could connect with an ancestor, especially several generations back that, you never knew in life would seem
Yeah.
totally woo woo or, just because I was that way too. I just would not believe that someone could somehow have contact with their ancestor through
Right.
whatever means. But the older I get, the more curious I become, and the less closed-minded, for lack of a better word.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
and so studying this kind of stuff just really fascinates me. And I'm similar way to people who believe they had past lives and going back,
Mm,
we're totally
yeah.
different people. And um, who am I to say that that didn't happen? I don't know,
Yeah.
whereas in the past I would have been like, well, of course not. That's ridiculous.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
and that openness as we get older, I think is part of that ancestral wisdom coming to root in us and help us see a way forward and see the ways that we want to be different. And even if that wisdom is, like you said, okay, I'm not going to do this because my parents did it to me and I didn't like its effect on me. Um,
Hmm.
like my husband and I, for example, we just celebrated our 35th wedding anniversary and we're
Oh,
still really happy together.
right.
But both of our parents are divorced and they divorced
Mhm,
after, like when I was already out of the house. My husband was in
mhm.
high school still, but they had, like 25 years, let's say, long marriages, but they were never happy, at least not that we saw them together. I
Mhm,
I never saw my parents being affectionate with each other, saying I love you, just
mhm,
seeming to be glad to be in the other person's presence. It was always um, either some kind of argument or little snipe like snide remark kind of a thing.
mhm,
Um, and so, when my husband and I got together, we did premarital counseling and we talked about, this is how my parents, what they do when they're in conflict with each other, and um, this is what, my family did. And so, how do we come together? And when we're in disagreement, find a way that works for both of us to resolve it instead of automatically, reenacting the patterns that we grew up with, which is all we knew that we had modeled
mhm.
for us. So there's a kind of wisdom in that too, and being able to say, okay, this is what I know doesn't work, courtesy of my ancestors. So what might work instead? What do I need to do differently to not have that outcome?
Yeah, and I think it takes a lot of, like, courage to be even willing to see that. Like, you could easily be like, "Oh, well, I just don't want that," and then not even go to counseling, or not even,
Right.
once I have that conversation, you just keep that promise to yourself and then hope for the best, right?
Yeah.
Or even just, like, I'm sure there's a million other examples of that, but I think that's really, like, yeah, like, that's really important, is be willing to kind of see the signs, right? Whatever it could be, woo woo or not, right? Like for example, the other day, I think I was in the kitchen, like I think I was like slicing an apple, and I felt this like chill. And I was like, that is not the air conditioner. Like somebody's behind me. And I just like something like that. Some
Hmm.
people might not, whatever. But anyways, just like whether you've directly experienced it, you read it or something like that. I do think does take a lot of courage, right? Like part of that feeling of enoughness or like um, showing up for ourselves, right? That is like a huge like that's huge, wanting to show up for yourself, right? It's not even just showing up for other people and hopefully your next like the next generation benefits. It's you're benefiting from it, right? Like and
Hmm.
then with the added benefit of others benefiting. Like for me, I feel like um right now I have a great relationship with my son. Again, who knows in the future what might happen, but right now I do, and I accredit it to me kind of having that courage to look at what others might have done, or just seeing examples out in the wild, right? Um, and I feel really like I mean, obviously there are days where I'm like, oh God, I'm like the worst mom in the world, right? But like overall, I'm like actually, I'm doing my best. I think I'm at least willing to kind of look at the mistakes I've made and then do what I need to do just to maybe never do that again, or at least admit to my mistakes or whatever it is, and then kind of move forward with it.
Yeah, and I think part of that too for me has been as I've gotten older, less black and white thinking. Like it was
Hmm.
easy to
Hmm.
look at all the things that my parents did that were unhealthy that I wish they hadn't done, either
Hmm.
with each
Hmm.
other or to me as a kid, whatever. Um, but now I'm also able to appreciate the good things that they did a lot more and see that, yes, there were these things that hurt me. There were these things that were not ideal, not a healthy environment to grow up in. But there were also these wonderful memories that I have.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm. Hmm.
and, I wasn't able to appreciate that until more recently, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think I'm just going to speak for myself. Like my 20s were like I feel like I think I'm not a psychologist or mental health professional or anything that, but like I feel like in your teens you're trying to like establish your own independence as your own person away from your parents, and then I feel like my 20s were an extension of that. So I never really quite appreciated um, all of the advantages that I had, right? Or all of
Hmm.
the ways my parents care for me, or the ways
Hmm.
that they maybe benefited from their ancestors. And so now I'm like, oh, and maybe it's because I have my own child. Maybe it's just because I've had a lot more years under my belt. I'm not sure, but I think I don't want to say appreciate the trauma. That's not what I mean. But at least I appreciate the ways in which I can be open to looking at those, right? Or
Hmm.
even to at least read stories and things like that about like just my aunts, like maybe generations past, like what has happened without
Hmm.
super cringing, like and be
Right.
like, oh, actually, okay, like I see this, and um, so yeah, yeah.
Well, we have about 5 to 7 minutes left. Is there anything else that you think is especially important to share?
Oh my, it's like whoa, that's what I'm kidding.
Mm.
Um, I mean, maybe this is a question for you. I mean, as well as me, while I want to think about the answer a little bit. Is if someone were like, I want to start like tapping into my ancestors' wisdom, right? Like, or understanding this. Like, where does someone even start?
That's a good question. Yeah. I mean, I think it starts with to the extent it's possible having conversations with the relatives that are still living. Um, and like you said, there's resources to help with that. There's, the books where you can that have prompts that invite people to reflect on their life and share stories from their childhood and all of that. Or it can be as simple as just, recording the person talking or whatever it
Mhm.
may be. But beyond that, it's an area where I freely admit I don't know much about it. Like I said, I mentioned the plant medicine and the different ceremonies in which other cultures get in touch with their ancestors. That's something I've never tried. I do believe it's legitimate, but I have no firsthand experience of it. I don't have anyone
Mhm.
specific
Mhm.
to say, "Oh, go see this," tribal person or whatever. Um, and like you said, some of it too can be gleaned through books, maybe not specifics about, your family, but at least about the wider culture they grew up in that shaped them. I mean, you have the greatest generation and you have like each generation, there are characteristics that are broad generalizations that can help us understand, okay, these are the historical events that they lived through. These are kind of the general characteristics that people in that generation tend to have. Um,
Mhm.
so that's at least a start. Um, but it's hard, like I said, for me, especially with my really common last name, to be able to go back and find out the kinds of things I would love to know. And much of what I would like to know, can't really be communicated in a book anyway.
Mhm.
Um, so it is hard.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think about the sort of the spiritual side, not like,
Hmm.
how do we even start that? And I will admit I'm obviously not an expert at it too, but I have attended like meditation sessions where there's I mean, I think if you want to do an online search, there's plenty of people who are
Hmm.
doing some really great work in this space. And I just call him Mama Rod Owens just because I'm more familiar with his work. But he does a lot of, I think he does a monthly like free offering where
Hmm.
he calls it free radicals, and each month you can offer up a free radical to someone who is free. So like example, Harriet Tubman is a free radical, right?
Okay.
She was a former slave, and she obviously like
Mm.
anybody who's about American history, like she's
Right.
pretty prominent historical figure, right? And so she's a free radical because she not only was free herself, but she helped others become
Mm.
free. And so that's just an example of someone who's does a lot of work around that. Every once in a while, like I don't think he does it every month, but I've been in such meditation sessions with him where he does they like call on your ancestors and he just like guided work with that. And I will admit, like this is just my experience, is when I first started doing some of these meditations, I was like, this is so silly. Like I just call on someone and like they're gonna come, right? Obviously, no, right? Like I don't think. I mean, I don't believe in ghosts, right? Like I don't like no, there's no ghost that's gonna come, but eventually, like sometimes I'm like I feel like the presence of someone. Like I
Hmm.
just mentioned earlier, like there's this like just gust of cold air, or like the chopsticks with a bowl of rice in. So I think it's not only just going to these sessions that helped me, but it was like being open to even seeing it. And even if it's like initially you're like, oh, that's just confirmation bias, like
Yeah.
lean into it, and then see
Yeah.
like if it's helpful, like and you're not harming anyone, like why not just lean into it?
Yeah, I would agree with that, definitely. And in my former career as a pastor, I talked to so many people who did get visited by loved ones, or
Mm.
who, as they were dying, were still able to describe what they were seeing as they were transitioning.
Oh
And
wow.
it was seeing deceased loved ones most of the time, and getting
Mhm.
messages from those loved ones that it's okay. Basically, you don't have to fear dying. It's a good thing, and we'll be reunited, kind of a thing.
Right.
Um, those kinds of stories. So again, even though I haven't experienced it personally, I know enough people who have that. And like I absolutely believe it can happen, even though I can't say, oh well, on this day this happened
Right.
to me, and I saw this ancestor, and they told me this, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Exactly.
So when you felt that cold presence, did you have any sense of who it was, or what any kind of message for you?
Um, no, I used to think it was like always my grandfather, but now I'm open to like maybe it being someone I don't even know, like
Okay.
that's not
Hmm.
in my periphery. It could be like a great grandparent, it could be even farther than that, just because I'm like, if I'm now open to like looking up history, right, of uh, people who were refugees to Hong Kong or things like
Hmm.
that. I'm like, I'm just gonna be open, and see what comes.
Yeah, I think that's the key to almost anything in life, basically, is being
Yes.
open and seeing what comes, and that's how we get new insights, and that's how we heal
Mhm.
our unconscious limiting beliefs, all of it. starts
Mhm.
with just being open to new ideas, new experiences, and new ways of being and living in the
Mhm.
world. Well, on that note, I guess we will wrap things up. I always enjoyed these conversations, so thank you so much, Sarah, for joining me and sharing your wisdom. And
Mhm.
thanks to those who have joined us live or who will see this later. Feel free to leave your comments once the recording's posted. Love to know what you think of this and what your experiences have been with contacting ancestors and what you've learned from them.
Yeah, thanks so much for inviting me on, Wendy.
You're welcome. Bye, everyone.